Thanks very much, Keong. I must admit, I haven't really heard this full presentation of Keong. I was actually quite spellbound by what you said, but so I'll try to get back to what I have to say. Now, before I'd just like to give a quick preamble. While many of us take it for granted, actually, HDB managed housing is the single boldest, most audacious, most radical, most successful, amazingly successful social policy that's ever been enacted by the PAP, and in housing terms, that has ever been enacted by any government in the world. We take this for granted, but if you look at it objectively, that's what it is. Now, it involves not just reasonably up-to-date and high-quality homes. It involves as well that are largely home-owned, a whole infrastructure, urban infrastructure of recreational centers, swimming pools, complexes, parks, park connectors, beautiful malls, as an integrated living environment. This is equal nowhere in the world, even in Scandinavia, the champions of social protection, there is nothing like it. So although we do like Scandinavia in overall social protection, as far as housing goes, we are still the king. Okay. In addition to this, we have to keep in mind, at the same time, HDB flats are also the single largest asset in savings and retirement for the majority of our population, especially the bottom 50%, where it forms an overwhelming majority of their savings. And therefore, HDB flats and the HDB program is the single most important vehicle and program for the shared prosperity and for the shared, security, economic security for all citizens in terms of Singapore's economic miracle. And therefore, these issues that Keong has raised, these long-term potential crises of asset decay, need for asset protection, of affordability, and of access, just pure access to even rental housing, need to be dealt with if this vehicle for a common sharing of our prosperity is to be maintained into future generations. Okay, therefore I'm going to talk about 5 broad aspects of this. I'm first going to say why these crises, that Keong has brought up, crisis of housing security, crisis of asset insufficiency, retirement adequacy, access, and affordability are inevitable crises the way things currently stand. They are baked in the cake, and unless we do something about it, they will be upon us. Secondly, I'm going to explain that while these solutions that you have just heard seem too good to be true, seem almost like a pipe dream, if you examine them carefully, they're not radical at all. They're actually bold but pragmatic and doable policies that have been done in several other jurisdictions and that we should seriously thinking of doing ourselves. Thirdly, I'm going to explain why the fiscal costs of such an ambitious program, even though it seems so ambitious, is actually eminently affordable, and that with our fiscal resources in the near and the longer term, we can well afford it and still have plenty left over for important social spending in healthcare, housing, social security. I'm also going to talk about how we can and it's possible to solve this impossible dilemma between asset protection of high resale flat values and trying to deliver the lowest, most affordable BTO flat possible. I believe the circle can be squared, and I will explain how. And finally, I'm going to enumerate the many macroeconomic ways in which these programs will benefit Singapore. Now, the lease renewal problem is the lease renewal problem is in long-term scenario policy finance what we call a predetermined trend or a predetermined crisis. That means to say, given current trends, it will be almost inevitable that we will get a crisis in housing security, that we will get a crisis in retirement adequacy, that we will get a crisis in elderly poverty, and the reason is as follows. The long-term trend embodied in the Ballas curve, which Keong explains how the asset value after 99 years will inevitably go to zero, no matter how high it gets in the interim. The higher it gets, in fact, the sharper and harder it will have to fall to get to zero. So this is inevitable as death and taxes. Secondly, the glaring fact is that for the bottom 50% of our population, the HD flat currently forms nearly 90% of net worth. And even by the time they retire, will form 75 to 90% for net worth now. The World Bank has told us that capitalizing your real estate is one of the key pillars of retirement adequacy. But in our case, the way that our assets are configured for the bottom 50%, it is not one of the main pillars. It is the only single pillar. And unless you shore up this pillar, there is going to be a crisis in retirement adequacy. Simple as that. Okay? Now, in addition to that, the crisis will be ensured by the fact that the bottom 50% for whom this is true will probably live much longer than we are currently expecting, right? And so the retirement resources will at some point be pushed into a deep crisis over their coming extended lifetimes. Finally, I would mention that right at the bottom 50%, bottom 10% of this 50%, the bottom quartile of this 50% is a hard core of absolute elderly poverty. We're talking about the cardboard collectors, people who do not have enough on a monthly basis to meet their basic needs. Currently, they number some 25 to 30,000 families, but almost inevitably, because of the retirement of poor, low-income baby boomers, this is going to treble over the next 30 years to 75 to 90,000 families. Some nearly 150 to 200,000 people are going to be living in absolute elderly poverty, cardboard collector poverty, HDB cleaner of table, uncle and auntie level of poverty, unless something is done. Okay? So this is baked in the cake because it's a demographic trend, given current income trends. And therefore, unless we diffuse what a colleague of mine, a very good friend of mine who is the chief economist and has been a veteran in IMF, chief economist of several international institutions, has called a long-term time bomb with a long fuse. This is a long-term time bomb with a long fuse, and we have to diffuse it. In addition, we know that Singapore is land scarce. In addition, we know that the population is increasing and people are talking even crazy talk about some of our top leaders about a 10 million population. So there's going to be increasingly scarce land and at the same time an increasingly fragmented labor market, right? The means to afford housing. So we have ICT, we have the new technological underemployment from AI that is yet to come that will make up to 30 to 40% of all jobs, including professional jobs, redundant or drastically changed in form, and could be at drastically lower pays. We have the gig economy. So these are all serious problems. Our flats are aging, our leases are aging, our people are aging and living longer, the poor people are exponentially increasing, and our labor markets are fragmenting over the 30-year horizon. So as things stand, as wonderful as our HDB system is, it is not future ready to meet these trends. Now the proposed proposals, while they seem too good to be true or even utopian, I would argue that they are bold, but they are pragmatic and realistic. Don't forget that the original HDB was far bolder, far more audacious than anything that we are proposing today. And so we are just proposing that we use a fraction of that boldness, a fraction of that audacity to ensure that this HDB continues to serve Singaporeans in the same way. Now, why do I say this? Lease reform and extension is based on internationally established practice. Take the biggest, most liquid, most well-established global real estate market, the UK, London market, right? It has established the UK Leasehold Reform Housing and Urban Renewal Act in 1993 that enables people to quite easily extend for 90 years at a time their leases. 90 years. We are only proposing 50-year at a time extensions. They can extend, established, they've been doing it since 93, 90 years at a time at a moderate peppercorn ground rent, okay? This is the UK. This is established, the number one global real estate, one of the markets in the world. China and Japan too, they have 70-year leases, long leases, China and Hong Kong that are extended routinely with almost very little cost. This is a small ground rent. So we should, therefore, the policy takeaway from this is extension of leases is not radical. Extension of leases is an established practice to deepen the real estate market on the one hand, and on the other hand, to configure land ownership to best enhance national development and the benefit of all citizens. So we should think of leasehold reform in that way and not as a taboo. It's been done. And we can do it in a way that benefits all citizens. Thirdly, government-funded rebuilding. We are saying that it should be done for everybody. We've already done this successfully. There's the SIRS program has already been successful. The only thing is it's restricted to 4 to 5% effectively of the HDB owning population. Now, with lease reform beyond the 100-year life of HDB flats, there will come a need to rebuild the flats in the middle of your leaseholding period. Question is, who pays for it? Since we have the precedent of SIRS, we propose the government pay for it. And the question is it affordable? Of course, the government shouldn't pay for it if it's not affordable or if it's fiscally irresponsible. But, I'm going to explain in the next slide how this is eminently affordable. We set up a sinking fund for this purpose. Finally, selling BTO flats at cost brings down, for example, a 3-room flat to $100,000, okay? And this is affordable because Singapore has already done the heavy lifting of acquiring land ownership in Singapore, 80% ownership of Singapore land. They did it through the Land Acquisition Act. That was an extremely radical, by the way, that was an act of land reform unequaled anywhere except in China and North Korea, right? You can't do that today, but we've done that heavy lifting already, and with that asset, we can afford to use the low construction cost that prevailed in the industry. $180 a square foot has been there for the last 10 years because improvements in material technology, improvements in prefabricated technology. We are assuming very conservatively that in the next 100 years, it inflates at 3%, 1% above inflation. Probably not going to do that. But even at that rate, it is eminently affordable. So why don't we do that? Okay. On affordability, the cost of rebuilding that I've just talked about, right? To give free rebuilding to every Singaporean, 1,050,000 flats, will cost overall a huge amount, a flagship amount of $200 billion, $200 billion. Seems a lot, but if you amortize it over the next 50 to 100 years, and you set up a sinking fund, it turns out you only need $1.5 to $2 billion, maybe $2.5 billion, if you want to include building new rental flats, another 100,000 new rental flats. So I'm saying $1.5 to $2.5 billion, 0.3 to 0.4, 0.5% of GDP. This is the fiscal resource that we are talking about. It is eminently affordable. Why? Because we have an effective fiscal surplus, what the IMF calls a structural fiscal surplus, of at least $20 billion currently. What does this $20 billion surplus consist of that is not being counted in current budget accounting? Half of it, or more than half of it, is the land sales to private developers, commercial, industrial, and residential, that should be part of revenues because when government alienates land to private developers, they do so on a 50 to 99-year lease basis, which they get completely back in 50 years and 99 years' time. And therefore, if you amortize it accordingly, this is a renewable fiscal resource. You get the whole thing back after 59, after all, right? So the IMF recognizes this and therefore recognizes this as a legitimate source of revenue. The IMF is no slouch in considering what is and what is not fiscal responsibility, right? They're among the hardest guys out there. And yet we are harder than them, right? We don't count it. But including the resource and including the investment income, we use currently about half of our net investment income under current budget rules. There is the other half. Some of it can be used. And if you include that other half and you include all the conservative accounting, we have at least $20 billion. And if you include the 2% GST increase, which seems to be baked in the cake, since none of us can prevent it, you're talking about another $8 to $9 billion, 6 to 7% of GDP, or 20 to $30 billion, of which we need a year, of which we need 1.5 to 2.5. So please tell me if we can afford it or not. Okay? So there will be ample fiscal needs left for things like healthcare, education, social security. Now, the key dilemma that we have in one of our proposals is we want to make BTO flats affordable, 3-room flats at 100K, right? Seems like a pipe dream, all right? But the question is, will it infect the prices of resale flats? Can we square the circle, the main contradiction? Can we have our cake and eat? Can we have cheap BTO flats and keep high resale prices still there for people saving, using HDB as a saving asset, right? And we believe the question is yes. We think it is yes because essentially you can do it theoretically if you segment the market. If you segment the market for resale flats and you separate it from the market from BTO flats such that there's very little arbitrage or trading between the two markets. And the way that we've chosen to best segment it is to increase the MOP, the minimum occupancy period, from 5 years to 15 years. 15 years is because 15 years is beyond the 10-year property market cycle. So it will have minimal impact, even though it's a very low price. And don't forget, there's still other premiums that resale flats enjoy. You can choose your exact unit. You can choose on the exact floor with the exact facing. You cannot do that with the BTO flats. You can buy your resale flat immediately. There's an immediacy premium. There's a choice of location premium. These, together with a 15-year MOP, should adequately protect resale prices from the much lower BTO prices. Okay, now in addition, why don't people say, okay, when I reach my 15 years, I'm just going to sell and make this huge, windfall gain? Why won't they do that? I would argue that that's unlikely too. Why? Because in our proposals are two embodied options that are very valuable. One is keeping your flat when you reach 65, be able to trade it down for the second bite of the cherry, for yet another BTO flat at cost, right? So you need to have that flat in hand. You can't just sell it straight away. Secondly, keeping that flat as a bequest, because don't forget, it is 100% going to be seized to the best, highest standard of housing available in the future, right? So these are important optionalities embedded in our proposals that will ensure that people don't just sell and dump, these new BTO flats once they reach resale conditions. So they will protect the value of resale flats. And the housing market the private market is similarly going to be protected. As you know, the resale market forms the basis for the private housing market. So if that is stable, private housing market should be stable. Also, the private housing market can easily be supported through relaxing current cooling measures or relaxing our foreign investor measures. And I think our policy concerns are not with how expensive private property gets. Very honestly, we want to cater to the affordability of 80% of our population within the public housing sphere. So I think that will be fine. Finally, I just want to say, at macroeconomic levels, I just want to reiterate, they will help ensure retirement adequacy and housing security. They will alleviate absolute poverty both at the elderly level, because they protect their assets from decay, and because they allow a second bite of the cherry. They will alleviate absolute poverty at the working level, even for the working poor, because the cheap rental flats will ensure people who now earn a wage that's below the living wage to have access to cheap housing, one of the biggest ticket items for monthly expenditure. It will boost long-term growth and productivity because, and this is a clear point for macroeconomists, because without needing this high unnecessary savings that you would otherwise have to have for your flats. You have more available for consumption, for investment, for entrepreneurship, et cetera, and therefore for growth and demand. And overall, it will provide social protection for the smooth transition of the transformation to the globally competitive smart city. Now, you heard Swee Yeoh talk about globally competitive smart city. It is essentially the optimal configuration of where you live, where you work, the residential, commercial, industrial, amalgamated with the ideal logistics, the ideal transportation, the ideal infocoms, making it a smart city with a much higher level of productivity. And we can do this with our entire workforce, whereas most other countries cannot. Okay? But the problem is, when you relocate 80% of your population in this way, and if you expect them to go to great hardship in terms of having insufficient retirement assets, in terms of having to have even elderly poverty as you relocate them, there is no guarantee that there will not be a lot of social resistance to this massive relocation. So for this reason, an adequate social protection or safety net is very necessary when you attempt to do large-scale restructuring for economic benefit, like they did in Sweden. They restructured all the Swedish shipyards, and they relocated all that labor into other industries very quickly because they had a social safety net that enabled that. And this, our proposals, is the social safety net that will enable this transition to our smart cities. So, our proposals therefore amount to really alleviating hardship, really increasing security and well-being. They amount to a new social compact in public housing, a new social compact of the kind that we all enjoyed with the first generation of PAP leaders. Pretty much the same in today's age, translated into to meet today's challenges. And just as it did for the first generation PP government, by resolving these current problems, these current contradictions of asset erosion, asset protection, accessibility, affordability, we can achieve these. We can strengthen social well-being and even national identity, I believe. Thank you very much.